maybe I think we've got 78 people, so I think what we will do now is get started. Hopefully, Don will be able to hear us in a second. So just firstly, just to say welcome to everyone. I hope you are all well and safe. This is a joint workshop between the OpenID Foundation and Open Banking in the UK. As you're all aware, the topic of this is conformance. And I'm just going to start out by just going through a few of the kind of logistics for today. This meeting is being recorded. We will make the recording available for everyone, so hopefully the content will be useful. And if you need to share this onward to colleagues of yours, the content of this, as I said, will be available and available to share as well. So just a couple of logistics. If during the session, we've got a number of sections. In each section, we will have some Q&A at the end of the session. And please, if you have any questions, comments, suggestions, you're all on mute, and Isla has the godlike power to unmute or put us all back on mute. So if you have any questions, then please use the chat functionality. If you want to remain anonymous, please send the message just to Isla and ask to remain anonymous, but feel free to chat to ask the question or make the comments to everyone. And then Isla will, at the end of each section, when we have the Q&A session, Isla will be able to go around and unmute you to so that you can ask the question yourself. The other point I wanted to make is that that of competition law on the agenda, which you should all have. There is a section around the goals, who the participants are, but there's a section on competition law. I'm not going to read that out to you. You've all been to enough of these workshops, so you should be familiar with this. But please don't say or disclose anything which will get you or your organisation in trouble from a competition law perspective. So I'm now going to attempt to hand over to Don. I don't know, Don, can you hear us? Yes or no? Don, can you hear us? Okay, I think what we'll have to do is come back to Don. Hopefully he will be able to, Don, you are unmuted. You should be able to talk now. Don?
Yeah, he's unmuted, definitely.
Okay, all right, in that case, I will, Don will come back at the end, and hopefully we'll get him during the course of the session so that he can hear us. Don will come back at the end and sum up for us. But in essence, the reason we're all here is that as both OBIE and the OpenID Foundation, we believe very firmly that conformance and certification is a very important part of a well-functioning API ecosystem. And we are actively trying to do everything we can as from a standards body point of view to provide tools and support to help firms use to test that they've implemented the standard properly and to certify that they have implemented the standard properly. This is important because it helps with overall consistency. It makes it easier for implementation. I think it'll make it easy for the regulators, although they haven't explicitly in the UK and Europe, haven't explicitly called out that certification is important. It's certainly something that is very much on the agenda of the OBIE for the CMA 9. And really the purpose of this is to help everyone understand the standards certainly at a high level today, just to understand some of the kind of nuances in the standards. And then we want to spend as much time as we can giving everyone a demonstration of the respective conformance tools. We have a session first of all that'll be kicked off by Nat Sakamura around FAPI, the FAPI working group, the vision for the FAPI profile. Daniel Fett from yes.com and the OpenID Foundation of the FAPI working group will then give us an overview of the FAPI and SIBA profiles. We've then got Joseph Heenan from FinTech Labs and also from the OpenID Foundation FAPI working group, who will give us a demo of the FAPI conformance tool, and then we will have some Q&A. And then we will have a break. We'll give everyone 15 minutes to go and get a cup of coffee, tea, whatever time of day it is, wherever you are in the world. And we will then resume back at 3:30. Freddie Gaara from OBIE will give us an overview of the standard, the OBIE standard of the APIs. And then Julian and Glyn, again from OBIE, will give us a demo of the conformance tool for the various functional elements of the standard. And then we'll have a Q&A. And then we want to leave enough time at the end to also have a follow-up discussion about any general issues or suggestions. We want to get as much information from you all as possible. Any ideas, thoughts, suggestions, questions, please don't be shy to ask. And then hopefully Don will be able to come back and give us a recap on the day. Okay, so I'm going to, without further ado, hand over to Nat. Nat, if you could, Isla, if you can unmute Nat, and Nat's going to introduce the OpenID Foundation and the FAPI working group and the FAPI profile. Thank you.
Yeah, he's unmuted.
Okay, can you guys see my screen? Great, all right.
Yes.
So thank you, Chris, for the opportunity for me to present OpenID Foundation and FAPI. It's my great pleasure to do so. I'm Nat Sakamura. I have been the chairman of the board of the OpenID Foundation since 2011. I'm also the chair of FAPI working group, so I'm taking this opportunity to explain a little about OpenID Foundation and FAPI, then pass to Daniel and Joseph for more details about FAPI. OpenID Foundation is a non-profit international standardization organization founded in 2007. It's specialized in the standardization of Internet Identity Layer and API access management. While many people do not realize it, Internet identity is one of the main pillars of this increasingly virtual world. Without the capability to securely identify humans and machines and providing access control, business in the cyberspace will not function. So our responsibility is getting heavier each day, especially in this after COVID-19 world. Our members spread out nicely among 36 nations, and our works are sponsored by these companies and organizations. Without the contributions from these sponsors, we cannot provide the free service for spec making and IPR maintenance. So I highly appreciate if you can join our club to show your logo here. Besides helping out the projects, membership also warrants these benefits. For example, as a corporate member, you can propose a new working group, taking the leadership in the working group, get discount in the certification fees, and so on. And if you upgrade to a sustaining corporate member, you'll be guaranteed a board seat to steer the foundation, create quote-unquote projects by direct funding, and so on. If you need more information about the membership, please contact our executive director, Don Thibault. He's waving his hand. So apparently he is now listening to us, which is a good sign. All right, so any standards are only good as they are used. Many standards are created but not used. However, that's not the case for us. Our standards are used everywhere. Apple, Amazon, Google, Microsoft, and so on all use OpenID Connect. It covers over 3 billion people. As of 2019, over 94% of Microsoft Azure sign-in are performed using OpenID Connect. Our new protocol, FAPI, is being used as the API access control standard by UK Open Banking and other that require higher level API protection. There are 3 business lines of OpenID Foundation. 1, standards creation. 2, testing and certification. And 3, marketing and education. This workshop happens to be item number 3 that's being done to further the understanding around number 2. Standards are created in working groups. Anybody who signs the IPR contribution agreement can join working group as a contributor. There's no fee associated with it. By agreeing to the IPR contribution agreement, individuals and corporations agree to provide the IPR free of charge for the implementation of the standards and the implementer's draft. The standardization process follows something called OpenID process that adheres to WTO TBT Treaty Annex 3. There are 10 active working groups tackling on the topics that are defined in their charters. Working groups meet mostly online to share information and develop documents using issue tracking systems and JIT repositories and mailing lists. FAPI Financial Grade API Working Group is one of those working groups. It provides general purpose, high security level API protection protocol based on OAuth to the OAuth family of specifications. Initially, we started with 2 rather simple security profile, read-only and read-write for FAPI. We thought it would be reasonably simple to specify the protocol, but it was not. There were a whole bunch of necessary but non-existing components in OAuth to the OAuth world. Thus, we have started to create necessary components on the way. For example, MTLS, JARM, FAPI, CIBA, and so on. And the timing of these projects starting are roughly plotted on this chart. And in this chart, I have shown ID1, ID2, and so on to mark implementer's draft number 1, implementer's draft number 2, and so on. These new components were just created just like we have created JWT, JOT, JWS, and so on the way to create OpenID Connect. But we are now getting there. Version 1 is in the finalization mode. There will not be normative change to the used portion. We may be actually removing public client related portion because it's not being used and not being tested as much as other portions. But after that, we are going to take it to the final vote that requires 60 days public review and 2 weeks voting period. And hopefully it can be finished by October this year. The same goes with the JARM and FAPI CIBA. MTLS has been transferred to IETF to become RFC 8705. And so did for PAR and RA, which is being standardized in IETF as well. The new news here is that we have started to create version 2 of FAPI. And that's going to be baseline profile and advanced profile. And I'm hoping that by the fall, we should have implementer's draft for these new versions as well. And I trust that Daniel is going to talk about them in more details. So the specifications are coming out nicely, but how do you know that you have implemented correctly? Test, obviously. Without it, you will not know if you have implemented correctly. And this is essential. This is essential in creating connected ecosystem. I heard from Gavin, the chairman of FData Global, that before the FAPI tests were provided, it took a long time for each party to connect to each other due to the variation in the interpretation of English written specs. Obviously, that is not scalable when you think about thousands of banks and fintechs. However, by testing against a single test suite, such time can be dramatically reduced. I hear that from weeks, it's been reduced to hours, if not minutes. Thus, OB and OIDF joined force to create OpenID FAPI conformance test suite and certification scheme. Since it's an implementation test, the real implementations are expected to test against it periodically to see if it is still compliant. Also, the scheme allows you to announce your conformance with the test logs so that your particular implementation can become an OpenID certified implementations. Also, such tests will reduce the amount of time you need to connect the system, so it will deliver substantial cost saving on the long run. Joseph will explain the certification after Daniel. All right, so that's from me. Do we field question here or later?
Chris, I
Yes,
guess.
hi, thank you. Yeah, I think what we will do is if we go straight into the next session. Thank you very much, Nat. We'll ask any. We'll have a session for any questions at the end. Then we can keep the flow going.
Nat, can you stop sharing your screen, please?
Okay, so I'm trying to find out exit.
Stop sharing at the bottom, it should say.
I think it's, yeah, where it says share screen at the bottom, you can click on that and go stop.
Oh, okay.
Or at the top. Right. That's fine.
Oh, it was top. I was looking at the bottom.
So if we can unmute Daniel, please.
Yep. Done.
Thank you. Daniel, over to you. Thank you.
Yep, thank you very much. Okay, welcome everybody. In the next 10 minutes, I'd like to give a brief introduction to FAPI, and in particular, the next version of FAPI, FAPI 2.0. So as you probably all know, most open banking standards, including Open Banking UK, but also many others, base some or all of their authorization functionality on OAuth 2.0. And that in itself is a good choice, because OAuth is an excellent framework for authorization. However, when you take a closer look at all those standards using OAuth, for example, UK Open Banking, but also other standards like STED in France, Berlin Group, Polish, Czech, and Slovakian APIs, some of which we did consulting work for, you notice that there are more requirements that are common to all these standards. And some of these requirements, of course, can already be covered by plain OAuth, but most of them so far have to be covered by bespoke solutions, by custom solutions defined in the specific standards and the specific APIs. And that means that they usually don't get vendor support, or often they don't get vendor support, at least not across many vendors. And of course, they can't claim standards compliance, and you don't get, for example, the testing framework that Nat just talked about. And these requirements that come up common across most of these standards are as follows. The first one is fine-grained and complex consents. That means, for example, in open banking and across all these open banking standards, you have situations where you want to say, I want to transfer or authorize the transfer of this amount of money from this account to that account. This is a relatively complex thing that you want to authorize. And so far, there's no compatibility in how to express these consents, or at least how to transport this information from the client to the authorization server. And we also learned that there's a need for concurrent consents. That means that you have multiple consents, maybe from the same application towards the same bank account, for example, but maybe you want to remove some of them, or you just want to handle them separate from each other. And so far there was no defined standard for doing that. And this all brought up some custom solutions for that. And then OAuth was not originally built for financial transactions. And banking and open banking APIs need strong security mechanisms. So we need to put those on top of OAuth. We also need to adopt the concept of defense in depth, because in OAuth itself, if, for example, one authorization code leaks to an attacker, then the attacker can misuse that code. But we don't want that when this is when the API is used for financial transactions. So we need defense in depth. And we need specific security features, for example, asymmetric client authentication. And for all of these features, security features, and for example, the consent thing, we also want a protocol that is interoperable. That is, ideally, we want to have the same on-the-wire protocol for all the implementations. Because if you have that kind of interoperability, what you get is conformance testing, as Matt already said, but on top of that, you can also check for correctness of your implementation. You can do security testing, essentially all with the same test suite, independent of where you have that implemented. It also means vendor support. You get broad vendor support. You just need to use whatever software vendor you want to, and they hopefully already provide support for the features in your API. And that, of course, means faster and more cost-effective implementations, and of course, also more robust implementations, because you're not the first to implement some specific feature, but you can use libraries and servers that already bring all these features with them. And these features, the hardening and the interoperability, that is what FAPI provides. FAPI is a security, interoperability, and feature profile for OAuth 2.0, or on top of OAuth 2.0. And we already see it adopted beyond financial applications, for example, in e-health, e-signing, and e-government applications. With FAPI, you also get FAPI-CIBA if you want decoupled interaction flows, so not only the traditional flows you see in OAuth. And now we also have FAPI 2.0. FAPI 2.0 is an evolution, a next step for FAPI 1, based on the experience that we, as a working group, gathered from the industry, from implementations of FAPI 1, and so on. So in FAPI 2, we have improved security, we have improved interoperability, and hopefully also simplified development. So let's have a closer look at the features of FAPI 2.0. One feature is PAR, or Pushed Authorization Requests. Pushed Authorization Requests is an IETF standards draft that sets out to replace bespoke solutions to transport the authorization request to the authorization server, especially if that authorization request contains a lot of data. So for example, if you want to authorize the access to multiple resources or something like that, many standards came up with solutions where you first create an external resource, also called the lodging intent. So you pattern, so you put some external resource somewhere, and then you reference that resource in your scope or claims. So the OAuth and OpenID Connect features, or they introduce custom authorization request parameters. And all of these things you don't need any longer when you have pushed authorization requests, because that is a super simple pattern essentially that gives you an interoperable interface to transport things to the authorization server to have then the user consent to them. That simplifies development. We expect vendor support for that. And as a nice side effect, it also minimizes the data that is transported in the front channel. That means that users and malicious users cannot easily interact or manipulate this data. So that's pushed authorization request. And there's also another standard called rich authorization requests. These are two separate IETF working group drafts. Rich authorization requests is a way to define complex and fine-grained consents. For example, here in this example you see here on the right, this is how you could capture a payment initiation consent in a rich authorization request. This is not a structure that is defined like this in the standard. It's just an example, but the standard shows you how to structure these things if you want to do that in your API. So that's rich authorization requests and pushed authorization requests, and these two go. So they are separate standards. You can use them separate from each other, but of course they complement each other. Then there's the grant management API, and that is a new building block that was created to address specific challenges when handling consents. As I said before, there are sometimes use cases where you really want to have parallel consents, and also other use cases as well. For example, if you want to synchronize the state of the consent between the relying party and the authorization server, they need to talk about which things the user consented to. And this is something the grant management API gives you. Or you can revoke single consents. You can also create a user dashboard, for example, or have the user manage separate consent in that dashboard. So this is the grant management API. And finally, as I said before, FAPI 2.0 provides security. Of course, it's adapted to the latest OAuth security recommendations in the OAuth Security Best Practice RC. So all the recommendations from there are already incorporated in FAPI 2.0. And just as in the first version of FAPI, we also have OAuth Mutual TLS, which is being used for client authentication and sender constrained access tokens, so that you get really defense in depth. And that also protects you against common attacks like code replay, mix-up attacks, and so on. In fact, the security of FAPI is very well understood. For FAPI 1.0, we did an in-depth security analysis based on the latest web security research methods. And for FAPI 2.0, we designed it from the start to be easily amenable to these research methods to create another in-depth security analysis. For example, we have a clearly defined attacker model, a threat model, to show you what FAPI provides you in terms of security. We have reduced the number of optional elements and options you have when using FAPI, which of course increases interoperability, but also helps when you want to study the security of the standard. In FAPI 2, we have two separate profiles, namely the baseline profile and the advanced profile. And the distinction is relatively simple. The baseline profile gives you defense against all the threats that we have laid out in the attacker model, and probably some more. And the advanced profile additionally provides you non-repudiation features if you need these. So coming to the last slide here, coming back to the big picture, what is the current status of FAPI2? Well, the basic documents, mainly the baseline profile, the attacker model, and the grant management API, have been adopted by the FAPI working group and are now working group documents, and the advanced profile is in preparation. Nonetheless, first entities have already expressed interest or even started adopting FAPI 2.0. For example, we see an ongoing integration in Norwegian e-health systems, and the FAPI 2 mechanisms will also be used to implement the Australian consumer data rights scheme. That's it from my side. Thank you, everybody, and I hope that you later have some questions.
Thank you very much, Daniel. Thank you. As I said, we will answer some questions. So we'll have time for questions and answers at the end of the next session, because some of your questions might in fact be answered in the next session anyway. So we are now going to move on to a demonstration from Joseph. So Joseph Heenan, as I mentioned, is from FinTech Labs and also the FAPI working group, and is the lead author or developer behind the FAPI conformance suite. So I'll hand over to Joseph now. Joseph, can you hear us?
Yep, I can hear you. Can everyone hear me? And can you see my slides?
Not yet. Have you?
Not yet.
Have you shared the screen?
Thought I had, but let me just try again.
Yes, there we go.
Yep, there we go.
Just to remind everyone, if you didn't manage to get on in Zoom and you are dialing in via a phone call, this is all being recorded, and these presentations and the recording of this will be made available to everyone.
Great, thanks, Chris. So as well as doing a demo, as everyone's mentioned, I'm going to run through a quick few slides as well first, just to give some of the background on the conformance suite and how to use it and so on. So I think Chris already covered some of this introducing me. Thanks, Chris. But yeah, I'm CTO at FinTech Labs. I was the lead developer on the open banking conformance test suite, which was then donated to the OpenID Foundation kindly by the open banking folks. And OpenID Foundation then kept me on to help develop it, which was very nice of them. I've been in this kind of game of doing software in these kind of areas and lots of others for 25 years. I'm actively involved in various of the OpenID Foundation working groups, and I've got a lot of mobile app experience, which will come up later a little bit as well. And I've been through the process with quite a few of the UK banks already of helping them actually get through the conformance suite. So I've got a good idea of the typical problems that people run into. So the FAPI certification program, so it's been going, where are we? Over a year now for banks, for OPs. The RP tests have been out for coming up for a year now. That's the test that relying parties could run. FAPI CIBA testing, which people mentioned earlier. CIBA is one of the protocols. It's not in wide use yet, but it does provide a decoupled authorization that can be handy in some cases. And we've got tests for that as well. All the tests support the UK open banking intent lodging, which obviously you need to be able to run tests against an open banking server. And you just have to make sure that when you're creating the URLs for your resource endpoints, you do put them in the correct structure that the open banking specification defines as to there's an exact place you should have the version number in the URL. And if you don't have that in the URL, the conformance suite won't know which version you're trying to test. And it may then fail because it makes a call for the wrong API version. And we've got copious instructions online as well, which are well worth a read. The general core goals of the certification program, Matt already covered some of this. It's interoperability, it's making sure that the security features are implemented correctly. And it's a lot of people will be using software that's already certified, but you still have to actually deploy it and configure it correctly for it to be FAPI compliant in your in your deployment, sorry. It doesn't test everything in OpenID Connect or OAuth. It's very hard to get 100% coverage in these kind of test suites, but definitely you would hope you're using a product from a vendor that's already run the other tests, and they would then tend to be less of a problem. Reasons why you should test. People that have passed the test have provenly lower support costs in terms of the number of TPPs that get in touch with them and can't actually get things to work. You know, the test suite is the way that you prove that your implementation is interoperable. And if you've gone through that, then it really should just work with third parties if they're doing their part and have also implemented the standard correctly. And as I mentioned, there's also tests for the TPPs that they can run, which does the interoperability checks on their side. So in theory, if both sides pass the test, then everything will just work. The test results are good evidence of compliance. So if you run into problems with any of the regulators claiming you're not compliant, they're an awfully good thing to have in your pocket. Evidence of compliance like this, there's always possibility that insurers will ask for this. It should reduce your chances of a security breach, as you'll have better knowledge that you are actually implementing the security features of FAPI correctly. And one of the things that we've seen from people running the tests is that a good percentage of people that run the tests have actually implemented the security features incorrectly and were less secure than they were meant to be. And anybody can run these tests against your server. Obviously, in the open banking system ecosystem, they'd have to be an approved TPP, but there is absolutely nothing to stop a TPP running tests against your system and then complaining to the regulators that you're not compliant. And that would, I presume, be a relatively embarrassing situation for banks to end up having to explain to the regulators. The certification tests can also be used to test app to app. I guess I don't know if everyone on the call will be familiar with app to app. This is the method where when a user is interacting with a TPP service on a mobile device, an iOS or Android phone, then when the authorization to the bank happens, instead of going to a bank's web page and having to put in lots of details, if a TPP uses app to app and a bank has implemented it, then when the TPP wants to connect to the bank account, it will just end up switching to the bank's application and the user will do a Face ID authorization or however they normally authenticate to the bank's app on their phone. Users obviously love that, and it's generally a requirement of PSD2 for anyone that has a mobile app as well. And the conformance tests can be run against this as well. It's using the same OpenID Connect FAPI protocol that's used on the web. And you will see different failures across the different OSs, because obviously when you're doing this on iOS and Android, part of the authorization server essentially is implemented in the iOS or Android code, and we have seen problems that are specific to the apps, like the app forgets to return the ID token the authorization server gave it, and then that causes third-party implementations that are looking to check the S-hash in the ID token to fail, and that can cause a lot of friction. And obviously you need to run for each OS basically, because the code is different on each OS. And the OpenID Foundation is currently making app-to-app certifications free until the end of June. So if you're already doing a FAPI submission, or if you already have a FAPI submission, it's well worth doing the app-to-app ones now and getting them in. I wouldn't advise running app-to-app unless you've already done the tests on the web and passed. Because in general, if it's not working on the web, you'll have the same problem on app to app as well, and it's generally easier to fix on the web. A few quick tips. I mean, some of you, this will be a bit too late for, unfortunately, but yeah, picking an authorization server vendor that's already FAPI certified is going to help you a lot. It doesn't guarantee you're going to pass because there are a lot of configuration options in these things. But it does mean that you're at least using a product that it is known that it can be configured to pass the tests, which several banks last year used products that weren't in that situation and they didn't pass the tests, and that caused significant amounts of friction with them and their vendors as they tried to get through. You should run the certification early and, you know, ideally before you're actually doing production deployments, because things are much harder to fix once you've gone into production. It's very rare for people to pass these tests first time. It's just far too easy to make configuration errors or to have not understood one part of the spec. An important thing to actually pass the tests and to make TPP's life easy is to design for interoperability. We saw in the early days several banks that the security teams had taken very paranoid decisions about exactly what would be allowed through at the API gateways, down to, you know, there were fields that the standards defined to be case insensitive, and the security gateways were insisting on a very specific capitalization. And that meant that some PPPs failed against that bank, and then they changed their software to work with that bank, and then it turned out another bank was expecting a different capitalization. So just try and avoid doing things like that. As I mentioned already, follow the instructions. They're there on the OpenID website. They're also linked from the tool. You can't miss them. A particular area that people run into problems with is getting the keys in the right format. So obviously to perform tests, the conformance suite has to pretend to be an OpenID Connect client, which means it needs client registration details that have been created in your system, and you'll need MTLS certificates and a JWK in the correct format. And people sometimes assume you can just take bits from a X509 certificate and paste them into a JWK and it will just work, and it doesn't work like that. They are actually different formats that you have to do a proper conversion between. So one of my old blog posts explains how to do some of the conversions, and there's a link to it there. So I'm just going to do some quick demos now, mostly walking through how you actually run the tests against a bank. So stop sharing this and try to share my browser instead. So hopefully you can see my browser now.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you. So I'll just start at the home page. So this is the home page of the suite. I'm actually running a version that's slightly ahead of the current version that's in production, but it's going to be going into production slightly, so it seemed better to do the demo on the newer version, as there's a few slight tweaks and improvements that make things a little easier. So the first thing you need to do, as you can see, is log in. The easiest way for most people is to log in with a Google account, as most people already have a Google account. So I'm just going to do that. And then you see the homepage for the suite. And then to get started, you just click create a new test plan. So what you'll generally be shown then is a screen that says select a test plan. So you'll select the one that says FAPI read write. I think my screen's flashing. Is that because there's somebody asking questions or saying they can't see or something?
Some people have put some questions in the chat, so we'll come to them later.
Right, okay, I'll just carry on. Thank you. So you pick the FAPI read write implementers draft 2 ID2 and Open Banking UT test. Then you need to pick a client authentication type. So either type is allowed by the Open Banking UK spec and by the FAPI spec. So you can either use private key JOT client authentication, or you can use MTLS. That's a choice that you will have made when you initially architected your system. I'm going to use MTLS in this case, I believe. And you have to select a FAPI profile. Obviously, if you're testing Open Banking UK server, you need to select Open Banking UK here, and that's part of what triggers the suite to do the Open Banking Pacific lodging intent mechanism that needs to be done before you can actually do an authorization and run the real tests. And there's a FAPI response mode, and for Open Banking, that's always plain response, which the help here will guide you to. Plain response is all that's part of the certification suite, and it's the only thing allowed in the OB UK standard. The alternative is JARM, which Daniel mentioned earlier, I believe, and is an option in later FAPI versions that might be preferred. So you'll then get presented with this configuration form. As you can see, I've already got the fields filled in because I did all this in advance to make sure I was going to have a demo that worked. I'll just run through all the fields quickly. This first field is called an alias, and this is a field that becomes part of the redirect URLs that you need to have registered for the clients in your authorization server. The alias is what allows multiple people to run tests on these systems at the same time. So you need to pick something that's unique to your client so you don't end up conflicting with anyone else that might be running tests. There's a description field, which is just a free-form field for your own notes to remind you what you were testing and so on. There's a publish field, which controls whether the results are made public on the Conformance Suite website or not. Default position is no, which means the results are only viewable by yourself when you log in with the same Google account again. You need to provide the discovery URL, which I'm hoping everyone in the audience will be familiar with what that is, as that's the main way into accessing a bank's authorization server. Then you need to provide details of the clients that you've onboarded. So you need to onboard 2 clients onto your system, and they need to be different clients. And the reason you need 2 and that they need to be different is that the suite tests various mix-up attacks when it's checking that you've implemented some of the FAPI security restrictions correctly. So for example, it gets an access token with one client and then tries using that access token with an MTLS certificate for a different client, which should fail because the tokens are meant to be bound to the Pacific MTLS certificate. And we need 2 valid clients to be able to test that. And that is one of the important security properties of FAPI, is that stolen access tokens can't be used by someone else. So it's an important part of the test. So you need to provide a client ID, the scope, which for most cases, for when you're testing Open Banking UK system, should be OpenID accounts. When the suite's testing an Open Banking system, it makes an accounts access query with the, I think it's called basic permission, that would just let it get a very simple list of accounts, and that's the API it uses to test the suite. You need to provide a JWKS for the client. This has to be a private key because the Conformance Suite has to be able to be this client, which means it needs the private key. And then you need to provide the MTLS credentials for that client. So the private key, the certificate, and any necessary certificate authorities that your server expects the client to present or requires the client to present. And then exactly the same fields for the second client again. And then the final step is filling in the resource endpoint locations. So you can provide all the, if you're APIs are all under the same base URL, which I think they are in a lot of cases. You can just provide the base URL for that, including the version. If you have your account requests and account resources on separate servers, you can provide the two separately. And if you're also on a open banking spec version prior to, I believe, 3.1.2, then your server might be requiring the XFAPI financial ID header is sent. And if that's the case, you can fill that in this field here. So once we've done that, we press create test plan. So this is now you've created your tests and you just have to run through them. And see, it's a bit of a list, but once you've got to this point, the tests are actually fairly quick to run. So I'll just show an example one running. I'm running these against an authorization server that's provided by a company called Authleet, who are one of the vendors that support the Open Banking UK service, but it's not actually a real bank, so don't be concerned that the screens don't look like a normal open banking experience. It is compliant with the Open Banking UK specs, and it will work exactly the same with your server, except your server will present more options and require the user to do more. So click on Run New Test to launch the test. The test appears, it does some initial onboarding and creating of the lodging of the intent. If you scroll down, you can see some of that that's happened. There's quite a lot of steps to check just to get to that initial point, and then it redirects to the authorization point. So we just press the proceed with test button, then it will launch the bank's interface. The user will be requested to log in, authorize access to the account. Then they'll be redirected back to the conformance suite, and they'll see the results so far, and I've not got any failures yet, which is good. This particular test, the user needs to log in twice, because this is one of the ones that gets access tokens with both clients and then tries using the wrong certificate with one of the access tokens. So I just have to authorize access again. Go back to the test results again. And then you'll see the test result is now showing us passed. If anything had failed, which I can show a quick example of. So if I instead just deny the request, then obviously the test is going to fail. So we get an error here saying we've got an error back from the authorization endpoint. You can see the test is failed and it's showing a status as interrupted, meaning the test didn't run to completion and not everything was actually tested. And if you just click on the failure, you can then see a bit more detail about this. So you can see I've actually got an error back saying the end user denied the request, which obviously gives you an idea of what I did wrong. And as I say, the next step would be then continue the plan, run the next test and so on, until you've gone down here and got a full set of green results. Once you've got a full set of green results, or occasionally you might get a warning as well, which a warning is showing if there's a recommendation but not an absolute requirement in the spec. If we found that you weren't following the recommendation, you get a warning, but you're still able to certify with a warning. As long as you don't have any failures, you can certify fine. So as I say, I was going to talk a bit more about the show a demo of app-to-app and the RP test, but I think I've only got a few minutes left, so I'll just talk quickly about that instead. If you were trying to test app-to-app instead, you just run this exact same process, but you do it on a mobile device. So for iOS, it's probably easiest to do on an iPad, where you've got a bit of more screen real estate to play with, which makes the test suite slightly easier to use. But you just run through the exact same process on an iPad in Safari. When you press the proceed with test button, where you'd normally launch the app the bank's website. Instead, that will just open the bank's app, and then once it's approved, the bank's app will redirect back to the test suite. That's just using the normal app-to-app mechanism. It doesn't require anyone to do anything special on the server side to support the conformance suite. So long as app-to-app works, everything does just literally work. It's a really nice way to actually do things. And then, as I mentioned, we've got a similar test harness for RPs. If you are running the RP test harness, you'll follow much the same process, except if I just go back to the home page and create the test plan, there's just a separate option up here for a relying party test, and you make much of the same selections and provide similar details. And then with the RP tests, when you actually run the test, instead of getting redirected to the bank's website, the test will tell you that you need to tell your client to interact now. So many people just build a command line harness that lets them exercise the RP against the conformance suite. So you may find you need to make slight alterations to your RP because the test suite doesn't expose things on the open banking TLS certificates that perhaps you might insist on. But otherwise it's very straightforward to run. So that quickly covers it. So I think if I just switch back to my presentation. So just quickly on the future roadmap. There are existing OpenID Connect core tests that run on a different harness. They're being ported to exist in this same website and test harness that the FAPI tests run in. That probably doesn't affect anyone here too much. As I say, for FAPI certification, you only need to run the FAPI tests. They are going to have improved UX and coverage compared to the older Python tests. If anybody has run them, they should be launching this summer. We're going to have some tests for PAR as well in the hopefully not too distant future. Again, it's not particularly relevant to Open Banking UK because I don't think any banks are using PAR, and I'm not sure you're permitted to under the Open Banking UK specs, but it is an option under FAPI in general and part of FAPI 2.0, as Daniel mentioned. And obviously, at some point in the future, when the FAPI 2.0 specs are further along, we're going to have tests that cover those as well. But the FAPI 1.0 tests are here and there, and they're the ones that are relevant to anybody in the Open Banking UK ecosystem. So that's basically the end of my presentation. The conformance suite is all open source. You can view the source code online if you want. You can download it and run it locally if you want. There's APIs, so you can integrate it into your CI as well, which I think a few banks have done, and they just automatically run it against their internal development versions so that when they share to production, they're pretty sure things are going to pass. That's the URL for the production deployment. As I say, that's going to be updated some point in the next week to show the same UI I showed just there, but the differences are very minor with just a few extra hints and help points. And if you need help with this stuff, then you can email certification@oidf.org. You'll generally get a response within a day, so long as you're not asking really difficult, involved questions. And that's me.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Joseph. Thank you. So just going to open this up now to questions. If you have any questions, if you can please read them, so put them into the chat. So this is questions for either Nat, Daniel, or Joseph, to do with the FAPI profile and conformance tool.
So I think
Right.
there were a few questions, so I can just run through those quickly if you want,
Thank
Chris.
you.
So
Yes, please.
I've got a question. Will the test suite be expected to run on all live versions of OP APIs? I guess that's actually probably a policy question. In terms of the technical thing, the suite can run against all the APIs.
Yeah, so maybe I can answer that one. So
Yeah.
So the kind of history of this is that originally when we were developing the security profile within the kind of UK open banking program, we originally came up with a sort of stepping stone security profile called the Open Banking Security Profile, which was redacted in place of the FAPI profile about a year and a half ago, I think. Now I can't remember the exact timing of that. And at the time, we had, as Joseph mentioned, a conformance suite that Joseph had developed for OBIE in the UK, which was to test against the old profile. And many of the banks ran the test, and after a period of time, the majority of the CMA9, the 9 largest retail banks in the UK, and a number of other banks also ran the test and certified against the old profile. And what's happened since then is that profile and the conformance tools and processes now been sort of redacted, but we are playing catch up with banks now looking to move from the old open banking profile towards the FAPI profile. Certainly in this group and in the OpenID Foundation and the technical design element of OBIE, which I chair, we haven't ourselves set a specific timing. This is very much up to implementation and requirements to certify are up to either the regulators or in the UK the OBIE, the other bit of the OBIE which deals with setting timelines. So we have this sort of delta and this gap at the moment between banks that have certified against the old profile and a very small number who have certified so far against the FAPI profile. So if you are running this tool and testing against a bank's API, then you may find that a large number of banks aren't fully FAPI compliant yet. We hope and expect that situation will change as soon as possible. What we do in this regard is we do have in the OBIE, we have something called a transparency calendar, which is an online portal which allows each bank to disclose when they're going to upgrade and what their plans are for upgrading. It's maintained, each bank maintains their own timetable, and we continually try and work with the banks to keep these things up to date. But we are in a sort of transition period is the point I wanted to make.
Yes, I guess that's quite an important point. Thanks, Chris. So yeah, just for clarity, the conformance suite will fail any implementations that are still using that old open banking security profile. You do have to be supporting FAPI for this to work. If you're following the recommendations in the open banking security profile, the changes are really minor. It's really down to minor things like I think FAPI requires request objects to have EXP and the open banking security profile didn't. So obviously that's something that you can very quickly thing. The area that people run into a lot of problems with is that some people didn't follow the recommendations in the open banking security profile and they still use client secret basic or client secret post, and those are not allowed under FAPI. So if you're using either of those, then it's a much more problematic uplift.
Hi, we've got a question from Nick. I'm just going to unmute you.
Hi.
Hi.
Yeah. So we're running this in our sandbox environment at the moment. using the certificates, the TPP certificates we can get off the sandbox.
Nick, can you just let everyone know which organisation you're from?
Sure. Cash Plus.
Okay.
So yeah, we're running the OpenID conformance tool in our sandbox environment at the moment, using the certificates we generate on the sandbox directory, open banking directory. But I was just wondering, is there any way, we don't have a TPP license, so is there any way we could actually certify ourselves without involving a third party that is a TPP?
Nick, I can answer that. There are two options for you. So Nick, as a, you are under PSD2, you have the regulatory status of an ASPSP, is that correct?
Yes.
In that case, you do also have the license of a TPP, both AIS, PIS, and in fact CBPII. So you have two options. If you want to certify and this is an important note for everyone, if anyone, whether you're an ASPSP or whether you are a third party of any description, if you want to run these tests against a production environment of a bank, of an ASPSP, you will need an EIDAS certificate with one of the regulatory roles in them. So, you know, this is now effectively a requirement under a PSD2 and the RTS that in order to access these APIs in a production environment, you do need an EIDAS certificate to identify yourselves in as it's phrased in the RTS. So the choice you have is either procure an EIDAS certificate with one or more of those roles, which you should be able to do because you do have that regulatory status, and then you can test against your production environment. In fact, what you can do, if you are using the Open Banking Directory sandbox, you can, you have a number of choices about exactly how you do that, but you do need a production EIDAS, sorry, an actual EIDAS certificate. The other alternative you have got, which I don't think is as good an option, it's something you should do anyway prior to certification, for, as Joseph mentioned, but you can test against your own sandbox. If you were to certify a sandbox implementation, I believe, and Joseph can correct me if I'm wrong, it would be clearly flagged on the certification page of the OpenID Foundation. It would be certified as a sandbox, not as a production environment, which might create some issues for you if your production environment then doesn't meet the requirements and doesn't behave. It's a bit like you're saying you've passed something, but your production environment doesn't do it. So I would suggest the best option for you would be to obtain an EIDAS certificate and run the tests. I think there is possibly a third option. There are a number of authorized third parties in the UK and across Europe who, one of the services that a number of these third parties provide is a technical service provider where they can use their production certificates for testing and live proving, and they offer that service as a commercial service to banks who don't have the bandwidth to do their own kind of live proving activity. So you have three options there.
Okay, so as we're not technically a bank yet, we don't have our banking license. I've just been told by one of my colleagues that he's saying that EIDAS route that you were talking about, getting a EIDAS certificate, might not apply at the moment to us. Is that right? Or
I don't think so. I mean, I can check, but I mean, I've outlined three options for you. If you want to reach out offline,
that'd be great,
I can find out a little bit more about that for you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much.
Right, we have also John Hemming. I'm just going to come to you. I'm unmuting you now.
Hello, then I put the text in, which is really this question of what we do whilst the specifications are silent when it's respect to certain things. For instance, a string representation of an X500 name, and what you find is that different ASPSPs reject things for different reasons. So some expect the string representation to be one way, and it's a question of the order of the RCNs or whatever, the elements of the distinguished name anyway. And I'm wondering whether or the audience, for instance, some want a URL, some want the organization ID. And I'm wondering what people think in the meantime of actually suggesting to ASPSPs that rather than be very prescriptive about items, saying there is only one value they will accept, so content type has to be application JWT, for instance, that they might accept one of two types. So it could be content type application JWT or JOSE, because it's easier that way than trying to be prescriptive and having the row about which one it should be. And obviously, over time, the specifications can specify very precisely what it is so that there's no uncertainty. But at the moment, there are areas of uncertainty which do cause implementation problems.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say in general, in the areas that the FAPI test tool covers, there isn't so much of that uncertainty. I know there are issues with the DCR spec, which I know because we've talked about them in the past. The FAPI tool, where there are some places where multiple values appear to be allowed by the spec, the FAPI tool does try using different variants of them and expects the banks to accept them all. So one silly example being, I think when we're sending particular requests, there's a content type header which can either be application application JWT with an optional char set UTF-8, and we try it with and without the char set and with a space between the value and the char set. So we do try to cover values like that. Say in a lot of the cases in the FAPI specs, then it is just prescriptive as to which value you should use, and the general RFC principle of be strict in what you send and generous in what you receive can be applied to some extent, but it gets tricky in some cases because then you get people saying, well, my thing works against bank A, bank B requires what's actually in the spec and only and doesn't work, and whose fault is that then? And the answer isn't always obvious, so it can be a double-edged sword.
Ilo, I just noticed we've got a question from John McRobb that I think Ralph has actually answered. One of the services that the OBI directory allows is that if you've purchased a EIDAS certificate, so the OBI directory requires all TPPs to have a valid EIDAS certificate now. But if you have an EIDAS certificate, you can swap that out for an OB cert effectively, and you can use that for testing, providing the bank that you are testing against, if that's your own bank or another bank, does allow that. So one of the kind of risks that firms have stated is that the EIDAS certificate has been published as part of the results. So I think that answers John's question, but I think Ralph's answered as well. I'll just give you a little bit more flesh on that.
Yeah, I think that's it. I think everything's been covered for now.
Okay, if anyone has a question that hasn't been covered, we will have a little bit of time at the end as well. So we're going to break now. I'm just going to share my screen, which will have the agenda on it. So we do have a break now for 15 minutes. If you want to go and make yourselves a cup of tea or coffee, if you can be back here at 3:30 sharp, please, and then we will kick off with the kind of mirror of this process, but looking at the OBIE standard and the functional conformance tool. Thank you very much, everyone. I will see you in 15 minutes.
Thank you. Just unmuted you, Chris. Okay.
Thank you, Ola. Thank you. Thank you, Ola. Oh, it's very echoey. Stop my screen sharing there. We will just give a few people drop off. I think we'll just give people another 2 minutes to join up.
Freddie, I've unmuted you in preparation to.
Awesome. I'm just going to share my screen now. And can you just confirm that you see the presentation?
Yes, we can see it. I'm just going to give a quick overview introduction to this in 1 minute's time. Okay, thank you, everyone. So thank you for staying with us and coming back if you went away and came back again. Just to recap actually on the previous, there was a question around use of certificates for testing and the fact that the tool exposes these certificates. I think this is something that has come up before. So if you are an ASPSP, but you're an e-money institution and you don't have a banking license, it may be that you don't actually have the regulatory roles and can't purchase an EIDAS certificate. You need to check with your compliance team as to the status of that, but certainly what you should be able to do if you're using the Open Banking Directory is what you should be able to do is use a Open Banking certificate for purposes of testing, because that private key does get lodged with the test suite, certainly in the case of the VAPI tool. So if that's the case, then using a temporary Open Banking certificate and then revoke the certificate. Yes.
Great. Sorry, I just lost connection. I'm not sure if everyone else did.
I think it was you, Ryla. I'll double check. I think it was just you. Freddie, could you hear me okay?
It was a bit patchy, but yeah, coming through.
Okay, apologies. So I think the point I was making is if you are an ASPSP using the Open Banking Directory, in any case, certainly a good option would be to use Open Banking certificates and to revoke those certificates after testing. So create certificates purely for the purpose of testing would be a good recommendation for doing that. Okay, so I am going to hand over to Freddie now. Freddie's been the lead architect of the read-write API standard. Freddie's going to give us a quick overview of that. And then we will hand over to Julian and Glyn, who will go through the functional conformance tool. Thank you.
Okay, hello everyone. I'll try to be real quick in giving this overview because it's Glyn and Julian that have all the fun stuff. So just to bring everyone up to speed, current state of play, we are on version 3.15 at the moment with the specifications. I think the conformance suite is one minor version, one patch version away from there. You can see all our specifications at the URL over there, standards.openbanking.org.uk for those of you that are not familiar. The OBIE standard is fairly large in volume. It covers a number of areas to address almost all of the PSD2 requirements, and it covers everything in the account space. I think we have a comprehensive set of resources that we can expose and have standardized over there, ranging from the expected accounts, balances, and transactions, but also things like statements, which was something that the card providers thought were they were responsible for issuing under their PSD2 needs, Bennies, direct debit standing orders, and scheduled payments, the underlying products and offers that are associated with an account, and the parties that are associated with the account. In the payment space, we cover 7 types of payments, effectively immediate, future dated, and standing orders for domestic and international contexts, which makes it 6. And then we have a 7th type for bulk payments. We've got a fairly detailed specification around how events should be created and handled. This is primarily aimed at the CMA9, who have certain directions to publish events of things that happen on their systems. We use the underlying SCT format for security events format for events, and the specifications being fleshed out to cover push notifications as well as aggregated polling. And finally, we have specifications for dynamic client registration. We see this as a fairly important part in getting TPPs up and running in a rapid manner. And this covers not just the register part of the specification, but it also has the other dynamic client management operations as part of the specification. The current version of DCR is absolutely comprehensive. For avoidance of any doubt, we now support the ability to have different types of certificates and different trust anchors. There's no mesh between the dynamic client registration specification and the OBI directory. We can have a situation where a registration can be done with software statement assertion issued by the OB directory using OBI certs, or OBVACs as we like to call them. Or you could use OBI directory but with QVACs, or you have the option of even using custom SSAs, which are not written to the OBI directory standard issued by SPSPs or other third parties, and you use QVACs in that situation. So we've completely segregated out the dependencies on directory with that. So this slide kind of gets into a little more detail around what is required for each of those situations. In both the first couple of situations where you're using OBVACs instead of QVACs, the SSA must be uploaded. The EIDAS certificate must be uploaded to the OBI directory. This allows us to ensure that a EIDAS certificate has been issued and meet that RTS requirement. And we can have the DCR payload signed by either a signing key on the JWKS that has been uploaded to a JWKS, or it could be signed by an external signing key. We can support all those various combinations. We'll take questions a little later in the session when we open up to the QA session. I'd like to hand over quickly to Glenn and Julian straight off. I'm going to stop sharing now.
Right. Glenn, you're unmuted. Are you going to go first, or do you want Julian to be off?
It might be best if you unmute us both for now, because in the interest of time, I'm just going to go sort of a quick overview and then go straight into the demo, if that's okay. Cool. So kind of over the next sort of 20 to 30 minutes, we want to give you an introduction to the functional conformance tool. But OB has also created a number of open source tools that allow an implementer to test the implementation against the standards. So we also have the DCR tool. Both tools are available, open source, Bitbucket, and Dockerized. Julian, are you sharing your screen?
No.
So what we'll do is we'll just give you the sort of context behind the functional tool, which tests AIS, PIS, and CVPI, and then we'll go straight into a UI demo of that tool.
Okay. So OB is about banking standards. Specifications define our standards. We use OpenID and Swagger to help define the API interfaces for the specifications. So the functional conformance tool uses specifications and Swagger to basically define testing strategies for the OB APIs. Currently, we support the OB APIs for accounts, payments, and confirmation of funds. And the tool accommodates from version 3.1 of the specification up until 3.1.4. I think 3.1.5 is out this week sometime. So we're about specifications. We're about pulling all of the information together. We're about building a suite of tests that test coverage over those three main APIs. So there's two things that determine how an API implementation should behave. The first one is guidance and definitions in our specifications. So these are the online documents that you get to from the Open Banking homepage. And then along with the specifications, the textual descriptions, we also have the more programmatic interfaces, which are the Swagger and Open API files. So they're formal definitions of endpoints, response codes, and data formats. So within the tool, we use the Swagger definitions to typically examine ASPSP responses. And then we also take into consideration the wider API, the wider Open Banking specifications, and there's various areas that you can't define in Swagger. So things like the results of sequences of code, calls, anything that's time related, and things like, for example, if you've got an account transaction listing and you need to check that the appropriate pagination takes place across multiple calls to that endpoint, then that's something which isn't easily expressed in Swagger, but within our tool, we're able to accommodate those types of requirements. Sorry. So the tool consists of three main parts. There's the discovery part, which is basically the collecting of information around the system and the test. So typically that will be the endpoints that have been implemented for the specific API under consideration. So for example, with the accounts with the accounts API, there are probably 10 mandatory endpoints, and then a whole bunch more that are optional depending on the ASPSP in question and whether or not they've implemented it on their online channel. For the testing, the tool allows us to basically craft any response we want and examine any aspect of, to craft any request that we want and to test any aspect of any response. So we basically can literally do anything with it. We can point to anything and we can send any piece of data we want. The data is typically expressed in JSON. So all our test cases are defined in JSON. The tool uses JSON pretty much throughout as far as like defining data formats and exporting data formats. We've also got a reporting capability. So when the tests are run, the results of those tests can be exported in a report file, and then that file can be passed over to Open Banking. We can examine it. If you pass all the tests and we're happy with it, then you can get a certification from that.
Yeah, I guess it's also worth mentioning that the tools has kind of two primary functions. The first one obviously is to help them implement it, to implement the standards correctly. And the reporting part of it is if they so choose, to submit the results from those test runs to open banking for certification. So we kind of split the tool up into these two areas. Reporting isn't something that is mandatory with the tool, but is there to help guide submission for certification. So it can be used by non-CMA9, and it can also be used by TPPs and vendors that want to use it as part of their testing suite as well. And this is the same for our DCR tool, which can actually be run as part of your CI too.
Very cool. So as mentioned, most of the inputs and most of the output of the tool, we use JSON for that. In the discovery phase, we have two JSON configuration files. We've got the discovery.json, which is endpoint definitions for the API and the test, and then we have a config.json, which contains credentials, certificates, account numbers that you want to test against. These two files are input through the user interface generally, but they're also exportable, and so you can back them up to a file and then simply paste them in when you want to use the same information on a second run of the tool. Within testing, as I mentioned, we use JSON throughout the test cases to actually have the test definitions. So in theory, everything's readable. And that allows sort of some flexibility around how the tests are put together. Again, with the reporting, the main report file is simply a JSON file. It has the submitter, it has dates in there, it's got the number of passes, number of failures, and then for each particular test, it shows which one passes, which one failed, and also the reasons why the ones that failed. Oops. So just looking at a simple test case. As you can see, it's defined in JSON. There's two main sections, an input section and an expect section. The input section defines the request. So in the example, we've got a get method on the accounts endpoint. We're also setting a number of request headers in there. Some of the data will come from the configuration file. Some of the data will be dynamically generated. We're quite flexible with how we can put data into the tool and use replacement parameters and pass data from one call to the next, etc. So there's quite a lot of interesting things we can do with that. In the expect section, that defines the conditions which constitute a test pass. In this particular example, we're looking at the HTTP status code, so we're expecting a 200 from that. We've got schema validation switched on, which means that every field within the response is examined to check that it is suitably passes the schema check, so all the field validation takes place. So anything defined in the Swagger file is applied to the response at this particular stage. And then also we've got the capability of having a whole range of additional tests against the data that should be returned. So we can look at the headers, we can look at the body, we can look at particular fields in the body, whether they're there or not. We can look for particular values in particular fields. We can check that a particular field is the same as that it was on the previous call and hasn't changed. In this particular case, we're simply looking for the XFAPI interaction ID being present in the header as an example. Okay. Prerequisites for running the tool. It lives in a Docker container. That makes it easy to deploy. So basically, the idea is that all you need is a laptop with Docker installed, and then you're more or less good to go. We presume that you've got OB transport and signing certs because you're testing out open banking systems. You'll also need your account numbers for things like the accounts endpoints. Then also you'll need to know where your well-known OpenID configuration endpoint is, and that needs to be accessible to the tool because we interrogate that for some of the values that we prompt you for as far as signing methods, authentication methods, etc. So we sort of using the OpenID configuration to sort of to constrain the types of values that you're presented with in the configuration screen. So in order to run the tool, then it's simply the Docker command below, and you end up pointing your browser at localhost to actually run the tool. So if you just give me 5 seconds, I'll get the thing going.
While you're doing that, Julian, I guess one of the other dependencies and prerequisites of running the tool also is that you have conformed and run to the OIDF security profile, because part of the journey involves us interrogating the well-known endpoint and doing the client authentication grants, etc. So we expect there is a dependency on that, and we do expect conformance, although we don't test it directly.
Okay, so so this is the main screen of the functional conformance tool. The main thing that you actually do here is to input a discovery template, which are the 4 boxes on the bottom. They're basically examples. So we generally use, or for the purposes of this particular demo, we'll be using the Ozone model bank using test credentials. And so this is where you access that. Also of note, on the right hand side, there's actually useful reference information for the APIs. So if we look at payment initiation and click on that, then it actually has built into the tool, even though it's only for 3.1 of the specification at the moment. You've got basically all the definitions of all the fields that you require for a particular call and what the response types are. So request types, you've got response codes and the particular response headers and data formats, etc., etc., etc. So that's actually quite valuable for figuring out particular fields that are required for the various calls that we're using. This is all sort of generated from the Swagger file information, but it also gives a view of the types of definitions that exist within the Swagger file, which are the things that we check all the responses against. So moving on to the tool. So the first thing that you'll require is a discovery file. So for the purposes of this demonstration, I'll be using a discovery file to cover the accounts and transactions endpoints, and also the CBPII confirmation of funds APIs. So I have one that I prepared earlier, which is over here. So looking briefly at this, you can see that this is our JSON discovery model format. We've got the API specification at the top with the name. We've got the URL which goes to the actual specification documentation online. We've got the version, schema version, which is the Swagger. We've got the manifest, which is the set of tests within the tool that we're referring to. A few extra bits of information, and then we move on to the endpoints. So these are all the endpoints that the tool will test as part that this discovery file defines. So again, for accounts, I think there's 10 mandatory ones, and then there's a bunch at the end that are optional. So so this is where you put the endpoints that you've implemented, and so these are the endpoints that will be tested. So the way it works is that the actual tests that get generated are dependent on the endpoints that you have in this file. So if you've got only 10, then you'll have less tests than if you had the whole set. So it figures out which endpoints you have, and then it only extracts the tests for those particular endpoints. So in this particular file, we've got all of the accounts endpoints, and then we also have the confirmation of funds API, which is obviously a smaller API and just has a simple verbs on there. Okay, so this is the discovery file. So if I just cut that and paste it into the tool, and then so once the definition of the discovery file is in there, we'll hit next, and then we get onto the configuration screen. So the first thing it does when I hit next is to go to the OpenID configuration file as defined in the discovery file, and examine the fields on there. and then it will come up with this particular screen. So I'll go through it very quickly. So usually what happens is that you'll enter this information once, and then you'll have a JSON view over here which contains all the information that you've just typed in, and then you'll sort of cut and paste that away somewhere safe. And the next time you can just paste the details in, so you don't have to go to each individual field every single time. But just to give you an idea, so you've got public and private keys. So these are OB transport and OB signing. You've got the account ID that you're using for the account and transaction APIs. Any statement ID if you've got statements in there. Various transaction dates, so client IDs. Most of the stuff should be fairly obvious. Happy Financial ID. Then we have stuff around the well-known endpoints, so you can OAuth response types, and these values will be pulled from the well-known configuration. You've got auth methods, etc., etc., etc. Then you've got some things for payments which aren't actually used in this particular case, and then at the bottom we have the confirmation of funds where the information is where you input the information for that. So again, I've got a configuration that I prepared previously. So this is what the JSON will look like. So you have the certificates, all the client information, etc., etc., etc. It's not that big, so it's not. So we'll take that, and what we can do is go up to the top, go to the JSON view. Oops, let's bring it back. Go to the JSON view, paste it in, and then we can look at the form view again, and we can see that it's populated all the various fields that we're interested in, along with the CVPII information at the bottom. So once we've done that, we'll hit next. What happens now is it's going off to the authentication servers, and then it's going to the resource server to do the initial consents. So we're basically for the set of tests that we've got, we are figuring out the PSU consent URLs so that we can get all the appropriate tokens. So here we've got a list of all the tests that happen for the accounts and the account transaction specification. We've got the consent URLs, which it generates. So we effectively require 2 tokens to run this these tests, and then we have the same down the bottom for the CVPII stuff. So if we click on here, then it opens a new window. We go to our model test bank using test credentials. So it doesn't matter if you see what the password is. We log into that, we select the account that we want to give permission for, we confirm it, and then it effectively redirects back to the suite, catches it, close that window, and then on the consent line, we can see that it's acquired the first token that requires to run the test. And for the second one, we do exactly the same. Hit login, confirm, and then we'll have the acquired as well. And then we go down the bottom to the CVPII and do the same again. Just to acquire the token for those tests. Obviously, the funds availability gives a different prompt on our model bank test system. And again, the redirect hits our suite. We get the box, we close the window, we go on the bottom and check. We can see that the token is acquired and that the waiting for consent button is now turned to a run button. So when we press this, all the tests will run. So I'll hit it, and then if we go to the top quickly, we can see the tests that are running against our Ozone model bank. In total, I think there's about 85 tests, and each one is testing a whole variety of aspects of the particular endpoint in question. And then it does the CVPII tests. So at the end of the test run, we've got we have the results on the screen, obviously. For the ones that fail, we can see we have the ability of just clicking on it, and it will tell us the reason why. So in this particular case, we can see that the status code that was expected was a 400, but it got a 403 forbidden instead. So that's basically a starting point for figuring out what went wrong. It also gives a list to the specification and the area within the specification where it talks about the particular area that we're testing. So once you figure out what that difference is, you can click on the link to go to the spec to get more information about what we think the test has failed on. Obviously, you know, sort of if you're willing to discuss with us the nature of the failings, and you feel that what we're sending back and what you're giving, you're correct and we're not, then we're always happy to listen to that and to consider it. Sure. And in the past, you know, we have changed our position on one or two items as a result of those types of conversations. So this is the sort of the basic result of the test. So you put the information in, you do your PSU consents, you get them, and it runs all the tests against your implementation. You can have multiple runs against multiple APIs. And in this particular case, we've used 2. You can actually have the payments in as well. The reason why I didn't do the payments this particular time is because it has 6 additional consents, so it takes like quite a while. So if you're submitting to OB, you may want to do them all individually, each one per API rather than all at the same time. So that's your choice. So once we've got this far, we've got all the information on the screen, and then we can we can then export these results and submit them to OB. So assuming that we have passes for all everything's green, then we can hit the export button, and then we end up on this screen. So we have to put in some basic information like the testing environment, particular brand, authorized name, and then product type, and then a bit of information to agree. And then if you want, you can actually sign the submission with your own digital signature, as the suite already knows about, just to confirm it's you. But you know, most people tend not to do that. But anyway, so once we've filled in this information, we can export the conformance result, and it generates the report, and then we can click on here to download it. When we download it, we can open it up, and we see that there's 5 files in there. So we've got the original discovery file in there, and we've got the report of all the tests that I'll show you in a second in there. We have the actual tests that are run for both CDPI and the accounts as well, included in the actual test report. And then we have this item called response fields, which is a fairly new item, and it's sort of in a little bit of a transitional phase. So the intention with response fields is to actually capture for a particular ASPSP all of the response fields that they have returned across all of the tests for this particular submission. So the reason why that's useful is because it gives TPPs a view of which particular fields an ASPSP may be returning when the fields are sort of conditional or optional. So sometimes it's not clear if a particular field is present, if it's not mandatory. So the idea with this was to start off for a conversation around building up a database of that information and making it available. Anyway, so if we go into the report, then this is the JSON for the report. So there's an ID, there's days and times, there's the fact that we have 2 failures, and then there's things like who's it certified a particular brand, so it'll be the ASPSP and the person within the ASPSP, signature bits if we were using them, and then it goes on to list for each specification that is submitted as part of this report, the particular specification that was in the test, and the versions, and then the results, and then it gives each particular test whether it passed or not, and additional information. If I just do a quick search for the failed ones, hopefully I'll find them, and I'll just change my view a second. Oops, that won't work. Anyway, so here we have the failed test, which so this particular line gives the failed information. So it basically captures the text that was in the user interface around the fact that, by the way, down the line, we have an expected 400 and got a 300, which is the key point around that particular test. So again, sometimes with the submissions, then submitting a test with a failed test in there isn't necessarily at the end of the world, provided you've had a conversation with us beforehand around what is acceptable and what isn't. So sometimes with the tests themselves, what we try and do is we try and evolve the test to make them sort of more precise and more accurate, which basically means that the tests themselves will change, but what we're actually testing remains the same. And so there are times when you may get a false, and so it might be appropriate for us to relax the constraints of a particular test or tighten them depending on the particular situation. And so there's always an amount of negotiation that can take place if you feel you're being hard done by a particular failure. But obviously, you'd have to have good reason to come to us along those lines. Yeah, so that's basically it. This is the content of the report, and then sort of based on the content of this file, sort of me and Glyn will sit down and go over it, check it all makes sense, look at the nature of the passes and any particular failures in there, and then OB as a sort of collection will come together and give everyone whether there's a certification appropriate or not at that stage. Okay, thank you. I think that's most of my stuff done. I guess we're looking for questions.
So thank you very much, Freddie, Glyn and Julian. Sorry, it's a bit echoey there. Yeah, we will share the files that are, sorry, this is echoey. I think if you're...
Sorry, I'm just muting the others. Give me one sec.
Thank you.
Right, cool.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So we will share this the presentation. I've put some links in the chat as well, but I think those links will be in the presentation. I think the point, just first of all, that the tool is open source. The source code, as Glyn mentioned, is available on Bitbucket. The tool can be downloaded, or requires to be downloaded and run in a Docker container. The process of testing, it's entirely up to any firm to run the tests as they see fit. The certification process, in a similar way to the OpenID Foundation certification process, is an actual paid service for firms who wish to have a certification published. And that process, once a payment is agreed between the firm and either the OpenID Foundation or OBIE, then there is a kind of ticket system. Certainly with OBIE, there's a ticket system where OBIE does provide additional help and handholding through the submission and validation of those results. So I think that was a kind of recap from me, but really just wanted to open up to questions. I noticed, Isla, we have a number of questions on here.
So John Hemming, I might just read it out because it's a short one. For how many ASPSPs are discovery JSON files available? And is it possible to obtain a copy of these?
Short answer is yes. So any firm who has submitted results to OBIE and where OBIE publishes the certification, in fact, let me just share my screen briefly. What you will see is on our on the OBIE. Sorry, one sec. I'm just going to shrink this down a bit. On the OBIE developer zone, there is a section called conformance certification. On that, you will see a link to functional conformance, and under functional conformance, it does cover all the instructions and also a link to the various release notes of the tool. And it lists all the firms who have certified to functional conformance. And if you go into any one of those results, you will see the test results you can download. And I think those test results will include the relevant, I'm not going to open it up, but the test results should include the discovery file there. I think as Glyn mentioned, Julian mentioned, we are looking at providing a more easily digestible way of accessing these discovery files. What's the, does that?
There's a few more. So I'm just going to unmute. Is it Balaji? I'm sorry if I've pronounced that incorrectly. I've just unmuted you.
Yes, yeah.
Balaji, where are you from, please?
Hi, we are from Santander, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Basically, we managed to run the security one, yeah, FAPI2 one in the local. But when we're trying to do same thing for the functional conformance suite, it is unable to run. Is there any way that you guys can able to help us to make it work in local so that it will be easy for us to test diagnose the local environments before go to prod?
So I think, can you unmute Glenn and Julian, please? They can answer that. But I think I answered that question previously. It's designed to be run in a local Dockerized container.
Yeah, we probably won't go on specifics in this call, Chris, regarding this, but we certainly can do a follow-up. The tool itself isn't hosted. It is designed to be run in a container so that it can run locally. Our setup guide too also contains a list of ports that you'll need to configure and be open if they're blocked, for example, internally. But yeah, there's also, I mean, I don't know if Julian wants to share this or has got it somewhere, but we've also got a command when you run the Docker image that allows you to create logs as well. So we have a help desk, and that help desk allows you to attach the logs, and from those logs we'll be able to see what issues that you're having without going into detail about what they are on the call. Does that answer your question?
Sorry, he went back on mute. Let me just unmute him again.
Yes. The only thing we can can you able to give us this proper link how to set up the ports to run it locally, yeah? Or is there any way can we get the code base to download locally and modify the proxy to run it what we are doing same as for the FAPI2?
Yeah, so the course isn't, the code base is entirely open source and is available on Bitbucket. We only Dockerize the code to make it convenient so you can run it locally. You can run the code base directly. There's a binary you can run directly as well, and you can modify that code base. However, if you are submitting for certification, there's a number of different checks that we do, and you will need to fill in like a self-certification form to say that nothing else has been modified on there. So it's a slightly different process we would have to go through if you were submitting for certification. But if you're just trying to get it to run for testing, you can modify the code. And as the code is open source and available, we also have a contributor guidelines on there as well. So if there's anything that you spot or anything that you need tailored for your particular circumstances, we can look at any pull requests that you open, and we can certainly take them into account for consideration into the main code base too.
Okay, thank you. That helps me. Yeah.
Thank you,
Glenn. Yeah, cheers.
Okay, so I can see that Stephen Sagar has a question. I've just unmuted you.
Oh, sorry. I wasn't expecting that. Excellent presentation so far. Excellent. Thanks for that. Used this tool so far, and we did some payment tests. And there's a switch to turn on the signatures I saw. Should we trust that? And is it required to be turned on to be compliant, or really doesn't matter? It's more like a FAPI compliance thing.
So firstly, maybe if we can keep Julian and Glenn, can you stay unmuted? Isla, can you unmute both Julian and Glenn, please?
Yeah, we do get feedback though, so it's quite difficult. So we'll try it, but I might just have to keep one of them off mute.
Just to turn the volume down a bit for both of you. And sorry, Stephen, while we're unmuting Glenn, Stephen, where are you from, please? Stephen, Stephen's gone on mute now.
Let me just, one second.
Sorry, if you are asking a question, either unmute you. Stephen, there we are.
I am back, yeah. Yeah, from 10x Banking. So we're providing a platform for banks that are acting as their ASPSP.
Fantastic. Sorry, from which banking, sorry?
10x Banking.
10x.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, hi. So for JDOS signatures, we currently have waiver 007 in place, which is due to run to sometime in June, I think. So at the moment, signatures are not expected to be validated by the ASPSP, and so a client-side TPP doesn't need to send them, and if it does send them, then they ought not to be validated. When we get to June, then what will happen is that there'll be two ways of going. One will be, I think, is defined in version 3.1.4 of the APIs, and the others in 3.1.3 and before. So all to do with the way that I think it's a particular job's put together. So at the moment, we expect signatures to be switched off as far as the conformance tool is concerned. Before we get to June, there'll be an update to the tool to handle the three situations which will then exist. So one situation is 314, and after that, one situation is 313 and before, and then the other is as per the waiver. So it will be flexible enough to be able to accommodate any situation. Does that answer your question?
That does. Thank you very much. Yeah, excellent. Thank you very much. Yeah, good.
Okay, Margus Lind, I'm just going to unmute you now.
Hi, Marcus. I was just unmuting you. If you could just let us know where you're from, please, as well.
Hi there. Yes, context information security. So the question is that you earlier mentioned that it's possible to run the conformance suit against the production instance without being registered as a TPP. So could you please go a bit more into that or give some pointers?
No, sorry. I think I said the opposite. I said the only firms who can access a production API are authorized firms with a valid eIDAS certificate. So you don't need to use your eIDAS, whether that's doing the FAPI tests or the open banking tests, the functional tests. You don't need to use your eIDAS certificate per se as the certificate to run the test, but you need to have one in order to be able to go via to go via the open banking directory to use an alternative certificate. So you can either access directly with an eIDAS certificate, or you can go via the open banking directory and use a open banking certificate just for the purpose of testing. But you do need to be an authorized firm to test a production instance.
Okay, thank you very much.
Just to add to that, Chris, if you're using a model bank such as Ozone, is there still an option to self-sign so that you could at least run the conformance suite?
Oh yeah, and so yeah, that's entirely in the competitive space to run against a non-production. That to run against a non-production API, it depends entirely on who is providing that test or sandbox instance as to what method of access they allow, and different firms have got different approaches there. Certainly, if you're a TSP or a TPP that doesn't have a production instance, you can run any of these tests against, for example, the Ozone sandbox provided by Open Banking.
Okay, we've got John McRobb too. I'm just going to unmute you now.
Hi, I was just saying that the discovery file, I think you can make that referenceable from the app server entry in the directory.
Yes, I think that was certainly the intention to do that. Sorry, John, where are you from, please?
I'm from Sainsbury's Bank. So we've had some inquiries from TPPs, I think, to make stuff more discoverable to them. And so, yeah, I would urge people to do that. I think we're waiting for ours to be published by OB, but once that's done, we will hook it up to the directory.
Yeah, I think that was the point. I wasn't exactly sure where we were with that in the process, but certainly the discovery files are made available on the conformance page, certification page by OBIE. and there is a field to enable ASPSPs to put a link to the discovery file wherever it's hosted, so that that can be searchable via the directory. Yes, you are correct. Thank you, John.
And one last one at the moment. So we've got Nick Macris.
Hi there.
Sure.
From Cash Plus again. Yeah, so we've got the functional conformance suite running in our test environment and sandbox environment, and we've managed to run that for the accounts endpoints at the moment, and that's running fine. But when we try and use it against payments, we get some errors. And I just heard that there's an option to turn logging on, because there's not a lot of useful feedback we get from the tool, I found, and there's not a lot of help online around these sort of errors. I've posted messages before in the Bitbucket issue tracking page, and I don't know whether that's the best output for these kind of questions, or whether we should go via the open banking ticketing system. But
yeah. So I think the issue log is more to do with if there are specific issues with the test. It's not designed, or the test suite, it's not designed really to be a sort of service desk or help function. If firms are have signed up to OBAE to purchase certification, if your intent is to be certified, then OB does provide a system via the service desk where you can raise a ticket, and OB will look into that and provide you with any help you need to go through the certification process. It's just, I think a bandwidth issue for OBAE, that they prioritize support for firms who've committed to going through the certification process.
All right, okay. And do we, regarding that logging, how can we turn the logging on for Conformance Suite? Is it a variable?
Maybe Glenn or Julian can answer that.
Sure, we can, in our setup guide, we do specify how to switch logging on. What I'll do is we'll post something in. Oh, someone's already done it for us. Thank you, Stephen, in the chat.
Yeah. Brilliant, thank you.
Okay, Chris, I think we've covered everyone's questions on here.
There's a couple more come up.
Oh, really?
So there's Aprit. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, I think Joseph has answered that one, unless you've got anything to.
Yeah, so I'll just quickly read those out. Arpit's asking, is there a link to the code for the FAPI tool? And Joseph's answered that. And then there's also Joseph's asked a question about the final certification. You have to do it on the cloud instance. So
that's relating to the security tool, Chris. So
yes.
The user was just asking if they could run it internally, like you can.
Right. Yes. Okay. Sorry, I was misreading that. Yes. Okay.
Okay. There's one more that's just come up, or is it a comment? Yes. Shall I unmute?
Yes, please. Yeah.
Right. Done.
Sorry, Glenn, it's me again. So the compose.yaml looks for, it only works for Mac. I think it will be good if you publish compose.yaml for Windows, which works.
Yeah, we originally added a Docker Compose into the repo when we had to run multiple containers, which is kind of what Docker Compose is for, or sharing environments, etc. When we had to run a database and a whole bunch of other things. However, we've managed to make sure that this is one single container, so it kind of negates the need to have Docker Compose. I guess it's only there for convenience if you just want to, Docker up or something like that. So The container itself using the run command is OS agnostic. It will run across anything. The Docker Compose isn't technically needed unless it's for convenience, because we're not having to run multiple containers. So I guess if we could understand why you would need that, we can certainly look at it. I think it's something that probably isn't needed going forward unless there's a business case for it.
Yes, so there is a specific case which is failing. Yeah, when you if you see the volumes in the compose.yaml, currently the one which you have, if you put whatever the default one which you are giving, it's not going to work for the Windows currently.
Okay,
so we manually need to, yeah, I think we need to modify the paths how we are doing. You see volumes-data/db where you are connecting to the MongoDB.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry, Glenn, this is a security question rather than a functional.
Yeah.
So yeah, I've just posted a URL on the chat. There are some notes about running it on Windows, but it's not officially supported. Linux and Mac are the supported platforms. Windows Docker is just a bit weird, in my opinion.
And one more thing is the builds we are doing is not compiling with the latest version of Docker as well. We are facing, and we need to. It will be good the stable version of Docker, which complaining against the suit as well. I think because we are keep on getting the updates from Docker. Yeah, when we get the update, the current existing running one in the old version is going to fail in the new version. So these kind of some issues which we need to look into as well.
I don't know if you can drop us an email about that, we can check. But I mean, I think I'm running an up-to-date Docker on my Mac and it's fine.
Okay. Okay, that's fine. Thank you.
No problem.
Okay, and we have one more.
Yep. So it's Santo. Just unmuted you now.
Yeah, hello everyone.
Hi Santo, just please can you tell us where you're from, please?
I'm from Santander.
Hi Santo.
I was just looking in the session. They told that we can integrate with the Jenkins, the FCS tools. Any other way? Any other hookups into the tools? Any other something like just for logging purpose and those kind of stuff? Anything like hooking up into the tool?
Is this related to functional conformance?
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. So this is quite an interesting question. So because the tool itself requires manual intervention to go through the PSU journey, and there's no headless defined, we have got an options to do headless, but obviously each ASPSP might implement headless differently, and this would only work in pre-production, not in production. So it depends how you want to run it. So we've created two tools. So when it comes to the functional conformance tool, with it being Dockerized, the output in there can be used in pipelines, etc., and run. And if you have a method of implementation for headless to run as part of your testing environments, then you should get you should be able to run this. However, the functional conformance tool as it stands at the moment doesn't have an output, and Julian can correct me if I'm wrong on this, in order to be able to sys out and be able to fail if a test fails on there. This is in contrast to the DCR tool, the dynamic client registration tool that we've got, which is now completely from the CLI point of view. So that can be run in pipelines, it can be run in your CI tool, and it has no UI element and can be run whenever you push code, etc. So, but we are looking at a headless way and a CLI way to run the functional conformance tool that makes that a little bit easier for banks.
Yeah. So in the past we've had headless functionality against the Ozone Model Bank. The challenge there is though that there's no standardization around how headless might work. So in the case of Ozone, we've had to get specially crafted certificates which have that capability from Ozone, and then presenting those basically allows you to get over the interactive parts. So where you go off the PSU consent, which is always a manual process. With a headless flow, you would get automatic consent to the consents that you requested, and therefore it wouldn't require a user intervention, and then you'd be able to run it within some type of pipeline or CI situation.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Thank you. Thanks for the answer.
Okay. I think we've run out of questions. So thank you very much, everyone. I think we're going to move on to the next question. And really, this is and the next section rather. This is really an ask out to everyone, everyone on this call. Now, if you don't feel comfortable, fine. But what we're trying to do is understand between the OpenID Foundation and OBIE what potential concerns, blockers, barriers there are to more of you running the tools and ultimately going for a certification. You know, I think we've highlighted. I think Nat really kicked things off in the right way with explaining what the kind of benefits are, and I think we've shown you how to run the tools. There is documentation, there is, you know, elements of support around, but really what we're trying to do is understand what's kind of stopping more firms from going through using the tools and going through the certification process. So if you've got any questions, I've already seen one pop up here. Please do put them in the chat. We'll also send out some form of survey, I think, to everyone afterwards to try and dig a little bit more. But we're really interested. This is an opportunity for you to ask us any questions, challenge us on anything we've said regarding that.
Okay. Do you want me to unmute Roshan?
Yes, please. Yeah.
Or are you going to read them out? Okay, I'll do that.
Well, I think yeah. I mean, I can read Roshan's one out. Roshan's from Nationwide, for those of you who don't know Roshan. Yes. So I think what he's asking is what is the gap analysis between the old OB security profile and the FAPI profile. And then there's a second question about what does it mean to be FAPI conformant, basic versus bells and whistles? What is the expectation? So I think maybe if we can start off, I don't know, is this something Joseph or Freddie maybe can give us just a high level summary of what is the, Freddie's offered to pick this one up. Maybe if we can unmute Freddie and give us a high level view of the difference between the open banking and the FAPI profile.
Hi. Okay. So the old open banking security profile is probably a lot more permissive than the FAPI profile is. I'll try to break down the areas where it differs. Firstly, the client authentication methods that are supported by the old open banking profile and the grant types that were supported. FAPI limits it down to MTLS and private key jot. I think the OBIE profile also permitted client secret jot. The second area of difference is on the limitations that FAPI sets around the algorithms. The OBIE profile was supportive of using RS-256 mainly because there were because of library maturity that was missing in those days. Third area, grant types. The OBIE profile allowed authorization code grant as well as the hybrid flow. FAPI limits it to just the hybrid flow. Sorry, I'm doing this from memory, so if I go wrong somewhere, please raise a hand, anyone. And then finally, as Joseph alluded to slightly earlier, the request object, FAPI places a number of additional constraints around the request object and the claims that need to exist in the request object JWS. mainly that it needs to be signed as a PS256 chart. It needs to have an expiry claim. Another interesting difference, and I think FAPI is silent on this. The OBI profile required that all tokens are bound to the transport certificate. That still remains the case on the OBIE standards, but I don't think that's a particular specification on the FAPI side of things. I think that covers it broadly. There will be other minutiae, but these are the key differences.
And I think it would be worth, I'm sure we have seen that written up in various places, but it would be worth putting that down in writing somewhere and publishing that so everyone can see that. And I think the point that Joseph made is that there are a number of vendors, and I can see a number of them on this workshop who are present here today. A number of vendors who provide fully FAPI compliant platforms. I think the issue is this is we are, as I mentioned before, we are in this kind of seem to be in this holding pattern where there's a significant number of firms got certified against the old profile but haven't yet moved to FAPI or proved that they have moved to FAPI. What is the expectation? I personally, my own personal expectation is everyone should move to FAPI as quickly as possible because that's the right outcome for the ecosystem. But recognizing some firms are on a path through upgrading their solutions, either moving to a new vendor who does have a FAPI compliant solution or implementing an updated version of that new vendor's product. And there is a timing issue there, which sometimes
it's Roshan again. Sorry to cut across you.
Yeah.
I just wanted to get a bit more clarity on the second part of the question. So looking at the FAPI specs, there are requirements that say shall, there are requirements that say should, and then there are requirements that say may. So reading that, shall is obviously, if you don't do these, you're not conformant. And then the shoulds and the mays, it's really just to gauge an expectation of the shoulds and the mays.
Joseph, maybe can you answer that one? I think you sort of answered it before, but if you can give us a view.
Yep, I can. So shall is an absolute requirement. You must do that or you can't certify. Should is classed as recommended by the spec. That's generally something that you probably should do. If you're not doing it, then you should be thinking about why you're not doing it and make sure you've got mitigations in place that would counter the reasons the spec was originally recommending it. And that will show up as a warning in the conformance suite front end, but it won't prevent you certifying. The onus is on you to make sure that you have got mitigations in place. May really is just optional. It's not something that you'll see the certification tool raising. I think in most cases it's probably optional, and most banks won't do them, so TPPs generally wouldn't use those features.
So Roshan, you would be able to pass a certification if you met all of the shoulds. Sorry, the shalls.
Shalls. Yeah.
The shoulds would just be warnings, but you could still pass.
So what's, I mean, we've been in conversations previously where I know the OBIE, the FCA are pushing forward the security aspects of industry, and in particular FAPI conformance. What's the expectation at a regulatory level? Is this mandatory? Do we have to meet all the shalls and the shoulds? Or is it kind of, well, we've got this working together in this collaboration, let's try and get there one day?
Well, I think what exactly, I can't speak for the regulators. I can't actually speak for OBIE specifically in this regard about expectations. But I think the minimum that I would personally expect would be to be certified, and that means meeting all of the shalls. That I would say is the kind of probably the minimum benchmark or expectation. I don't think the regulators are going to distinguish between the shalls and the shoulds. They just want to see whether it's the OBIE on behalf of the CMA. I think they just want to see firms being certified, which means meeting all of the shalls.
Yeah, and I think that's the same position the OIDF take as well, of the OpenID Foundation. It's if you're meeting the shalls, we will certify you, and the certification is the only kind of evidence that you can really show to the regulators.
Yeah, certainly what I wouldn't think would make much sense is to hold up certifying because you haven't met one or more of the shoulds. You know, as soon as you've met all of the shalls, I would urge everyone to try and meet those and get certified as soon as possible, if that sort of helps.
That does. Thank you both for answering that.
Sorry, one further clarification to what I was saying earlier. Mark Haynes been kind enough to point out over private message. FAPI does actually provide for a holder of key mechanism requirement using either MTLS or OAuth-B. So I stand corrected over there around the necessity for certificate-bound access tokens. It is an integral part of FAPI.
Okay, do we have any other questions, comments, suggestions, requests? No? Okay, well, thank you very much, everyone. I hope this has proved useful. I just want to reiterate that, you know, whether it's, you know, myself, OpenID Foundation, the regulators, you know, whether it's a hard requirement or not, I would really like to see more firms going through using the test suites, becoming certified. I think it's the right thing for a healthy open banking ecosystem. I think what I would ask very clearly, though, is that where firms are planning this to be as transparent as they can be with OBIE, if you're in the OBIE ecosystem, to be as transparent as you can be about your plans and the timing of it. It would really help everyone to understand where firms are on this kind of trajectory. If you're about to upgrade something or you're planning to be certified in a month's time, 2 months' time, you know, that's really useful intelligence for the ecosystem. It would significantly help the third parties to understand, you know, at what stage things are likely to change or improve in terms of interoperability. So transparency about where you are is a really important thing. OBIE, as I mentioned, we have this transparency calendar, and a part of that is to enable any ASPSP to disclose what you're currently doing and what you're planning to do and when as well. So please, that is a very clear ask from me. I'm hoping Don is now online and can hear us. Isla, can we unmute Don?
Yep.
I think I just wanted to leave the last word to Don to maybe sum up and give us his thoughts.
All right, he's off mute.
Hello, everybody. I hope you can hear me.
Yes, we can.
Two quick things. A look at FAPI from the inside of the OpenID Foundation. As you can see from the graphic behind me, the work in FAPI is closely coordinated with some other key committees. As we all know, open standards are an evolving beast, and it's important to keep them synced up with other relevant standards. And that certainly is the case at the Foundation. In the work that we do, the FAPI working group is closely tied to developments in the OpenID Connect working group. And importantly now, informing the work of a new standards development effort at the OpenID Foundation called the eKYC working group. We understand how these technologies and platforms are knit together, so we want to make sure that the standards evolve together. So as with the eKYC working group, as with the OpenID Connect working group, and importantly on the platform of choice, the Moderna working group. We're in collaboration with the GSMA. We're making sure that work done on OpenID Connect and FAPI and eKYC are all synced with the platform of choice, the mobile device, the smartphone, and the mobile network operators. If we take the lens back a bit, Chris mentioned the good of the ecosystem, and OBI was, through Chris, one of the keynote speakers at last week's US Financial Data Exchange Developers Conference, and shared some of the lessons learned from the UK with that very important, growing and dynamic work of financial services companies that many of you are members of in the Financial Data Exchange. So we're trying to, through the OpenID Foundation, promote a global open standard, particularly and importantly around the FAPI profile, because FAPI is informing other sectors and other standards development organization. And it also, we hope, will become part of the fabric of organizations like FDX in the US. We're closely coordinating with our EU liaison partners as well as groups in Canada. So having an open, global, interoperable security profile, I think, is in the interest of all, and certainly at the focus of the OpenID Foundation. And lastly, we salute all of the folks, not only at Open Banking and OpenID Foundation, but the growing interest in organizations like the SWIFT and the Open Banking Extensions Working Group. The International Institute of Finance is having a online conference tomorrow that will talk about technology standards and governance and regulations. So the whole world is watching this effort, and I just wanted to thank all the architects and engineers that are making their way through a very challenging set of standards and compliance regulations to make our ecosystem a safer and more resilient space. So thanks to Chris and Obi for having what I call the courage of the first draft and informing the rest of the world about how open banking might best be done. Thanks, Chris, and thanks, Ila, for keeping us all on track.
And thank you very much, everyone. As I said, please watch out for a follow-up. We will share both through the OpenID Foundation, through OBIE, we will share details of this. I think we will share some sort of follow-up to try and get some feedback from everyone as well. And we will share all of the speaker notes and the recording. So thank you, everyone. Please have a great rest of the week. Stay safe and watch this space for follow-up in the next installment. Thank you.